Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at H.R. 8371,
Okay.
a bill that really could change how we approach veterans' health care and benefits.
For sure.
And, imagine serving your country and then facing a health crisis and not knowing where to turn.
Right.
Sadly, that is the reality for many veterans.
It is.
So we're going to try to decode this bill and see how it could impact veterans and their families.
Yeah, sounds good.
So maybe you can tell the listeners a little more about why H.R. 8371 is important and why voters should care about it.
Yeah, so I think this bill is really important for voters to understand because it proposes some pretty fundamental shifts in how we view and approach veterans care.
Okay.
It goes way beyond just, tweaking the existing system.
So it's not just like, increasing funding here or there.
Exactly. It's looking at the whole picture.
Okay.
So things like giving veterans more control over their own health care.
Okay.
And addressing things that maybe don't get as much attention, like dental care
Yeah.
or mental health support for their families.
It's interesting.
It's a pretty comprehensive bill.
So where should we start with this?
Let's see.
What's like a good entry point for people to understand what this bill's all about?
Well, one of the big pieces of H.R. 8371 is about improving the Veterans Community Care Program.
Okay.
And, that's a program that helps veterans get care outside of the VA system.
I see.
So if they need something that's not available at their local VA, they can go to a doctor in the community.
That makes sense.
And Section 101 of the bill proposes that veterans could actually work directly with doctors to figure out what they need.
Oh, so they wouldn't have to wait for referrals within the VA system.
Right. Exactly. It could really cut through some red tape.
That sounds like it could be a game changer for veterans, especially those in rural areas.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, think about a veteran in a rural area who needs some kind of specialized care that's not offered at their local VA.
Right.
Under this provision, they could potentially bypass a lot of bureaucracy and get the care they need a lot faster.
So it seems like the bill is trying to empower veterans to take control of their health care.
Absolutely.
But are there any downsides to that?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's something that voters should be thinking about.
Okay.
While empowering veterans is super important, we also have to think about how to make sure they're getting good quality care.
Right. It's not just about access.
Exactly.
It's about making sure that the care they receive is consistent and meets certain standards.
Yeah, and that could be a challenge when you're talking about a wider range of providers outside of the VA system.
So how do we make sure that a veteran in Montana who's seeing a private doctor in Florida is getting the same level of care they would at a VA facility?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's something that lawmakers will have to consider carefully.
So it's about finding that balance between giving veterans more choices and ensuring that the quality of care doesn't suffer.
Exactly. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
So we've talked about access to care and quality of care.
Right.
What other key issues does H.R. 8371 address?
Well, another big one is dental care, which, believe it or not, is a huge concern for a lot of veterans.
Really? I wouldn't have thought of that.
Yeah, it's something that often gets overlooked.
Okay.
But the truth is, many veterans currently don't qualify for dental care through the VA at all.
That's surprising.
It is, and it's a problem that this bill is trying to address.
So how does H.R. 8371 propose to improve dental care for veterans?
Well, there's a really interesting provision in the bill. Section 144 proposes a pilot program that would offer dental care to veterans with ischemic heart disease.
Ischemic heart disease.
Yeah, it's a condition that affects the blood vessels that supply the heart.
I see.
And I know it sounds kind of strange to connect dental care with heart health.
It does at first.
But there's actually a growing body of research that suggests a strong link between the two.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so things like gum disease have been linked to an increased risk of heart problems.
I see.
The thinking is that by addressing dental issues, we might be able to improve heart health in veterans.
So this pilot program could provide some valuable insights into that connection.
Exactly. And if it's successful, it could be a stepping stone to broader dental coverage for all veterans.
And that could have a huge impact on their overall health and quality of life.
Absolutely.
I mean, think about it.
Yeah.
If you're constantly dealing with dental problems, it's hard to focus on anything else.
You're absolutely right.
It can affect your mood,
Yeah.
your ability to work your relationships.
It's all connected.
It's all connected.
And this bill recognizes that.
So this is definitely something that voters should be paying attention to.
Absolutely. It's a key part of the conversation about how we care for our veterans.
Now let's move on to another important aspect of this bill.
Okay.
Support for family caregivers.
Yeah.
Caring for a veteran especially one with complex medical needs, can be an incredibly demanding job.
It really can be,
And it takes a toll on the caregiver's own well-being.
both physically and emotionally.
Exactly.
It's often a hidden cost of service.
And H.R. E371 tries to address this by providing more support for caregivers.
It does.
And one of the ways it does this is by authorizing grants for mental health support for caregivers.
That's right.
That's Section 122 of the bill.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important step.
It is.
It acknowledges the emotional toll that caregiving can take.
And it shows that the government recognizes that supporting the caregiver ultimately benefits the veteran as well.
Exactly. It's about creating a ripple effect of care.
That's a great way to put it.
Taking care of the people who take care of our veterans.
But how would this actually work in practice?
Wow, that's a good question.
I mean, would caregivers have to go through a complicated process to access these mental health services?
Well, one of the things that's really interesting about this bill
Okay.
is that it pushes for better coordination between all these different support programs.
Okay.
So the idea is to create a single point of contact for caregivers,
I see.
so they wouldn't have to navigate this confusing web of services on their own.
So instead of having to call different agencies and fill out tons of paperwork,
Exactly. They would have one place to go for all the information and support they need.
so that sounds like a very practical and compassionate approach to easing the burden on caregivers.
It is, and it's something that I think a lot of caregivers would appreciate.
I'm curious, for those of you listening who have experience as caregivers,
Yeah.
what stands out to you as the most impactful change being proposed here?
We'd love to hear your thoughts.
We've only scratched the surface of H.R. 8371.
We have a lot more to discuss.
So stay with us as we delve deeper into this bill and explore why it matters to every voter.
It's an important conversation to have,
Definitely.
and we're glad you're joining us for it.
Absolutely.
All right, so welcome back to our deep dive into H.R. 8371.
It's a dense one.
There's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah.
But before we move on, I think there's one more issue we should touch on from the first part.
Okay, what's that?
Well, I think it's really important to highlight how this bill tackles veteran homelessness.
Right.
It's a really sensitive issue,
Absolutely.
but it's a critical one that we can't ignore.
Yeah, it's something that I think a lot of voters are concerned about.
Yeah, and H.R. 8371 doesn't shy away from it.
So what does it actually propose to do about it?
Well, one of the key sections here is Section 402.
Okay.
And that proposes increasing per diem payments to organizations that are helping homeless veterans.
Okay, so these are organizations that are already on the front lines.
Right, they're doing incredible work.
Yeah.
But they're often really strapped for resources.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And so this funding boost could really help them expand their services and reach more veterans.
Okay, so it's about empowering those who are already doing the work.
Exactly.
And what kind of impact could this have, like, on the ground?
Well, I think it could make a real difference.
Okay.
I mean, imagine an organization that's struggling to keep its doors open
Right.
or having to turn away veterans because they just don't have enough space.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking.
It is.
So with these increased payments, they could potentially provide more beds, more meals, more
Yeah.
support services.
Exactly. And that could really change the lives of veterans who are struggling with homelessness.
So it's a reminder that these policy decisions have real-world consequences.
Absolutely. They're not just abstract ideas.
They actually affect people's lives.
And voters need to understand that.
They need to understand how these changes could translate into tangible improvements for veterans.
Exactly.
So it's not just about throwing money at a problem.
It's about making sure that the money is being used effectively to help those who need it most.
Now, you mentioned Section 402.
Right.
What other parts of the bill address veteran homelessness?
Well, there's also Section 403,
Yeah.
and that introduces this idea of improved flexibility and assistance to homeless veterans.
Okay, improved flexibility.
Yeah, it sounds a little vague,
It does.
but what it really means is giving the VA more leeway in how they use those funds.
So it's not just about providing shelter.
Right. It's about recognizing that homelessness is a really complex issue.
It's not one size fits all.
Exactly. And so this flexibility would allow the VA to address those multifaceted needs of homeless veterans.
So what kind of things are we talking about here?
Well, it could be things like transportation assistance,
Okay.
so helping veterans get to job interviews or medical appointments.
Okay, that makes sense.
Or it could even be providing access to technology.
Technology.
Yeah, things like smartphones or tablets.
I wouldn't have thought of that.
Yeah, it might seem a little counterintuitive,
It does.
but in today's world, being connected is so important.
It is.
And for homeless veterans, having a phone or a tablet can be a real lifeline.
How so?
Well, they can use it to connect with potential employers,
Okay.
or to access online resources, or even just to stay in touch with loved ones.
Right, because isolation can be a big problem for people experiencing homelessness.
Exactly. And so this is about helping them feel more connected and
I
empowered.
see.
It's about giving them back some sense of control.
But wouldn't some people argue that basic necessities like food and shelter should come first?
Yeah, that's a valid point.
I mean, it's hard to think about technology when you don't have a roof over your head.
We're right. But I think the bill's emphasis on flexibility suggests that these things aren't mutually exclusive.
Okay.
It's about recognizing that in today's world, technology can actually be a tool to help veterans escape homelessness.
I see. So it's not either.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance.
Okay, so this flexibility could be really valuable.
I think so.
But are there any concerns about potential misuse of funds?
That's always a risk when you're talking about increased funding and flexibility.
Right.
And so I think it's really important for voters to demand transparency and accountability.
So that we can make sure that these resources are being used responsibly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that they're actually helping the veterans who need them most.
So it's not just about voting for the bill.
Right.
It's about holding our elected officials accountable
Absolutely.
and making sure that they're following through on their promises.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about homelessness. But let's shift gears a little bit to talk about another aspect of H.R. 8371 that could really change how veterans access care.
Okay. Sounds
This
good.
is Section 101,
Right.
and it introduces this concept of agreements allowing veterans to outline their care needs.
Right.
So this seems like a pretty big departure from the current system.
It is.
So what's the thinking behind this change?
Well, it's all about recognizing that veterans are individuals. They have unique needs and preferences.
Right.
And so instead of being funneled through this rigid referral process,
Yeah.
they could potentially sit down with a doctor outside the VA system
Okay.
and actually work together to develop a detailed agreement
I see.
outlining their specific care requirements.
So it's like creating a personalized healthcare roadmap.
Exactly, tailored to their individual circumstances and goals.
Okay, and would this agreement be binding?
It would.
So the VA would be obligated to provide the care that's outlined in the agreement.
Even if it's delivered by a non-VA provider?
So this really seems to shift the power dynamic.
It does.
It gives veterans a much stronger voice in their healthcare decisions.
Absolutely.
But are there any potential downsides to this approach?
Well, one concern is that it could lead to fragmentation of care.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, if veterans are essentially designing their own care plans.
Right.
How do we ensure that there's continuity and coordination across all those different providers?
So it raises questions about the VA's role in all of this.
It is tough.
I mean, if they're not directly providing the care,
Right.
how do they oversee the quality and consistency of the care that's being received outside of their system?
That's a really important question.
And another concern is cost.
Right.
If veterans have more freedom to choose their providers and treatments,
Yeah.
how do we keep costs under control?
That's a valid concern, and it's something that voters should be thinking about.
Yeah, it's about finding that balance between giving veterans more choices
Right.
and being responsible with taxpayer dollars.
Exactly, and it's not an easy balance to strike.
So before we move on to another key provision in H.R. 8371,
Okay.
I want to get our listeners' thoughts on this idea of allowing veterans to outline their own care needs.
Yeah.
Do you see it as a positive step towards empowering veterans?
Or do you have concerns about how it might be implemented?
Let us know what you think. All right, so welcome back to our deep dive on H.R. 8371.
Glad to be back.
We've covered a lot of ground,
We have.
but there's still a lot more to discuss.
For sure.
And one of the things I wanted to circle back to is dental care for veterans.
Yeah, that's a big one.
And, we touched on it briefly in the first part,
Right.
but I think it deserves a deeper dive.
Definitely. I mean, it's something that often gets overlooked when we talk about veterans' healthcare.
Yeah. I mean, it's easy to think of dental care as separate from overall health,
Right.
but the reality is they're very much connected.
Absolutely. And H.R. 8371 actually acknowledges that connection.
Okay, how so?
Well, there's a provision in the bill that's gotten a lot of attention, Section 144.
Okay.
And it proposes a pilot program offering dental care to veterans with ischemic heart disease.
And I remember when we first talked about this, I was kind of surprised.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are.
It's not an obvious connection.
It's not, but there's actually a lot of research that supports it.
So can you explain that a little more?
Yeah, so basically there's a growing body of research that shows a link between oral health and heart health.
Okay.
Things like gum disease, for example, have been linked to an increased risk of heart
Oh,
problems.
wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating.
So how'd that work?
Well, the inflammation associated with gum disease can actually contribute to plaque buildup in the arteries,
Oh, I see.
and that increases the risk of heart attack and stroke.
So this pilot program is about more than just taking care of veterans' teeth
Right, it's about potentially preventing more serious health problems down the road.
and improving their overall cardiovascular health,
Exactly.
which could have a huge impact on their quality of life.
Absolutely, and if this pilot program is successful,
Yeah.
it could really pave the way for expanding dental coverage to all veterans.
And that would be a major victory,
It would really acknowledge the importance of oral health for everyone.
especially those who have served our country.
Exactly.
So I think this raises a really important question for voters.
What's that?
Should dental care be considered an essential part of veterans' health care benefits?
That's a big question.
It is, and I think it's one that we need to be having a national conversation about.
Absolutely. And it's not just about whether or not we should provide dental care. It's also about how we do it.
So if we decide that dental care is essential for veterans,
Yeah.
how do we ensure that the VA has the resources and the infrastructure to provide that care?
Right, because it's not just about adding another benefit.
It's about making sure that it's actually accessible and high quality.
And that's going to require a significant investment from the VA.
So voters need to understand that.
They need to understand the potential costs and the potential benefits.
And ultimately decide if this is a priority that they're willing to support.
Exactly. It's about making informed decisions.
And it's about holding our elected officials accountable for those decisions.
Absolutely.
All right, so we've talked about dental care.
We have.
Let's move on to another important piece of H.R. 8371,
Okay.
and that's support for family caregivers.
Right.
We talked about this a little bit earlier,
I did.
but I think it's worth revisiting because it's such a crucial issue.
Absolutely. I mean, caring for a veteran can be incredibly rewarding,
It can.
but it can also be incredibly demanding.
Yeah, both physically and emotionally.
Exactly. And it often takes a real toll on the caregiver's own well-being.
And H.R. 8371 recognizes that.
It does.
And it includes a provision that specifically addresses the needs of caregivers.
That's right. Section 122.
Okay.
And that section authorizes grants for mental health support for caregivers.
And I think that's so important.
It is.
Because it acknowledges the invisible labor of caregiving.
Right.
And it shows that the government understands that supporting the caregiver ultimately benefits the veteran as well.
Absolutely. It's about creating a more holistic approach to care,
Exactly.
recognizing that the well-being of the veteran and the well-being of the caregiver are intertwined.
So can you talk a little bit more about what kind of mental health support these grants would cover?
Sure. So while the bill doesn't get into too many specifics,
Okay.
it's safe to assume that these grants could support a range of services.
Okay, like what?
Well, things like individual counseling therapy, support groups, even respite care.
Respite care.
Yeah, so that would give caregivers a much-needed break.
That's a really important point.
It is, because burnout is a real problem for caregivers.
Absolutely.
And so having access to respite care can make a huge difference.
So providing caregivers with access to these resources
Yeah.
could really help them cope with the stresses of caregiving.
Right, and ultimately ensure that both the veteran and the caregiver are getting the support they need.
It's a win-win.
It is.
Now, I think this raises another important question for voters.
Right.
How do we value the invisible labor of caregiving?
That's a really good question.
I mean, are we doing enough to support those who dedicate their lives to caring for our veterans?
I think that's something that we as a society need to grapple with.
Yeah, it's a question that goes beyond just policy discussions.
Right.
It's about our values.
It's about how we treat the most vulnerable members of our community.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into H.R. 8371,
Yeah.
there's one final element I want to touch on,
Okay.
and that's accountability.
Right?
I mean, we can have all these great ideas,
Yeah.
but if there's no accountability,
Right.
then the bill is just words on paper.
Exactly. And so H.R. 8371 actually includes several provisions that are aimed at strengthening oversight and accountability within the VA.
Okay, can you give us some examples?
Sure. So one example is Section 501, and that section mandates specific training for VA employees regarding the Office of Inspector General.
The OIG.
The OIG, right.
And that's the office that's responsible for investigating allegations of wrongdoing within the VA.
Exactly. So they play a really important role in making sure that taxpayer dollars are being used responsibly.
And that veterans are receiving the care they deserve.
Absolutely.
So this training is about making sure that VA employees understand the OIG's role.
Right.
And their own responsibility in reporting potential issues.
It's about creating a culture of transparency and accountability.
And hopefully preventing problems before they even arise.
Ideally, yes.
Now, there's another section that deals with accountability.
There is Section 502.
Okay.
And that section mandates annual security reviews at all VA facilities where department police officers have jurisdiction.
And I think this is particularly important given some of the recent concerns about safety and security at VA facilities.
It is. It's about making sure that veterans and VA staff feel safe.
So what do these security reviews actually entail?
Well, they involve things like assessing security protocols, evaluating the adequacy of security equipment, and even surveying employees about their perceptions of safety.
So it's a pretty comprehensive approach.
It is. It's about identifying vulnerabilities and then taking steps to address them.
And by requiring these annual reviews and reporting the findings to Congress, the bill is trying to create a system of continuous improvement.
Exactly. It's about making sure that we're always striving to do better.
So we've covered a lot of ground in our deep dive into H.R. 8371.
We have. It's a pretty complex bill.
It is, but I think we've managed to unpack some of its key provisions.
I think so.
And we've highlighted some of the potential benefits and challenges.
And most importantly, I think we've given voters some things to think about.
Exactly, because ultimately this bill is about more than just health care.
Right.
It's about our values as a nation.
It's about how we choose to honor the service and sacrifice of our veterans.
And it's about making sure that we're living up to our promises to those who have served our country.
And we hope that this deep dive has given you the information you need to engage in those conversations.
To ask the tough questions.
And to demand better for our veterans.
Because their voices deserve to be heard.
Absolutely.
So stay informed, stay engaged, and let's work together to create a future where our veterans receive the care and support they deserve.
That's the goal.